Archie!
Hello, ladies and germs, legionaries. I'm here today again, General Lance with Sergeant Barnes, and at the War Room we have Peter Vrangel, who is a military intelligence officer with the Army, and we're here to talk about the Army 2040. Welcome, Pete.
Hey, Lance, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having, coming on back on the show. I know we've had a couple different episodes talking about different crises, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or, the escalating tensions that are happening in Taiwan. And I think, a lot of the conversations that we've had both online and offline have been really interesting in the fact that it kind of begs the bigger question, right, as far as where is it that the U.S. military, specifically the Army and the ground forces, will go in the coming decades, especially with the peer threat as it's emerging of the PRC or Russia and the developments that have been happening in Ukraine. And so I guess I just wanted to ask you, what is, the Army 2040? What does it mean? What's it about, and why is it happening?
So there's two parts to that. The Army of 2040 is actually the result of, or will be the outcome of, what is the Army of 2030 initiative. So there's two parts to that. So the Army 2030 is more of the now, you could say near-term type of reorganization with the Army. And then the Army of 2040 is where the Pentagon HQ DA wants the U.S. Army to be, in around 2040. And so, with that comes a lessons learned analysis of the last 20 years, but also a lessons learned of how Russia's operations or invasion of Ukraine, and how the Army, the U.S. Army, can reorganize, reposition, and equip itself to fight those near-peer adversaries.
Yeah, and I think for most people, especially in the ASEAN community in the Milsphere, I mean, we are perceiving the conflict in Ukraine as the pace of future operations that will happen, or at least maybe a prelude to how war will be waged in the coming decades, right? So, a lot of the changes, of course, revolve UAS, in the sense of not simply reconnaissance and cheap drones proliferation, but also UAS in the form of ground combat autonomous drones, or even the UAS of automatizing freaking logistics and all that kind of stuff. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, how real is it, and how much is the Army investing in these kinds of cheap UAS systems to augment combat power?
To better answer that is probably to give just a little bit of history. So the U.S. Army went through a rather large reorganization in the very beginning of the 2000s, in and around 9/11, GWOT, and so forth, where essentially where the division, but we all that we're all aware of, the 82nd, 101st, and the 1st Infantry Division, were essentially broken up into much more maneuverable BCTs, the Brigade Combat Teams, and that's what dominated GWOT in the next 20 years, from 2001 until recently. Mm-hmm. The Army of 2030 is essentially reconstituting those divisions. So going into future operations, the brigade will no longer be the lowest level maneuver unit. It will actually be the division. And that is actually a pretty large endeavor. And so that could tell you how much the Army, the Pentagon, U.S. government is investing monetarily and personnel-wise into this transformation. Now, when you get into the specific systems, UASs, any type of future combat system, platform. If you're a nerd, you can go through any type of congressional budget. You can see the line items, and you can see where where the money is flowing is where the most the emphasis is being placed upon them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's within context, right? So with the Ukrainian invasion, with Russia invading Ukraine, what you're seeing is a shifting of the pendulum of this duality between offensive and defensive mindsets, which are typically only changed, or the catalyst for change is some sort of technological change. So World War I was dominated by much more kind of defensive mindsets. If you think about the trench warfare, limited gains, so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a technology change, the tank. First, it wasn't used very properly, but then when massed together for certain assaults, it became huge breakouts would occur on the Western Front and so forth. But then with the technology change and certain people's ideas and concepts were able to be put into action in World War II. So the shift from a defensive to offensive mindset between World War I and World War II is evident, right? Mm-hmm. World War II, you had much more maneuver operations. And that offensive concept has dominated Western militaries ever since. Now, GWOT, you can say, is probably an aberration, but still, it was still offensive operations. What has come up of this Russian invasion is much a pendulum swing back to a defensive mindset. You're getting trenches, you're getting cheap UAS systems that can do a lot of damage against $1 million, if not $1 billion pieces of equipment. Mm-hmm. So people want to be protective, right? So protection. You invest in protection. Well, protection is defensive. ADA, air defense, defensive, right? Mm-hmm. And so more money is being poured into that defensive mindset.
So it's interesting because, I mean, I've been of the conviction that since the mid-'80s, let's say, the technology has really decisively changed for peer adversaries on the conventional battlefield in the favor of the defense. And why do I say that? Is because of basically the invention of not just smart munitions, but also throwaway smart munitions of ATGM revolution, right? Mm-hmm. And you see this not just with TOW and all this other stuff, guide-by-wire, but also, javelin systems and so on. And you see this a lot in the early Ukrainian invasion where, excuse me, they freaking attacked my throat. Here, so basically what happened was, in the early Ukrainian invasion, the Russians just did a tour de force and just decided to, send these massive armored columns into the center of these cities, and mm-hmm. They got chewed up, and they got chewed up by I guess adversaries who were comparatively lighter armed, and if they had been in a context where, before 1985 or even 1965, the Russians would have been able to repulse that kind of attack, that counterattack in the defense. And it seems mm-hmm. like the reason why the Russians have, focused on a strategy of tension and attrition-based warfare is precisely because of the issue where now that there's UAS systems that give mm-hmm. really in-depth technology intel. Basically, it's hard to maneuver. It's hard to concentrate forces without drawing, fire, precision fires, and basically blunting any kind of iron, spearhead or anything like that. And so, my gut feeling about the transformation of the Army from a brigade-sized element, combat team focus to a divisional size one has more to do with emulating the coming prospects of attrition warfare. And I think mm-hmm. obviously this is done in the context of a hot war with China in the Taiwanese territory. I mean, is that your read as well?
Yes. The reconstitution of the division is directly related to China being seen as the closest near peer strategic threat to the United States. Yes, I agree.
Okay, perfect. And so I guess where I wanted to take this is basically ask you questions about 2040, and
okay.
How real is it as far as the Army is concerned about I guess there's electronic warfare and the possibility of not simply jamming, but also EMP munitions to
Hmm.
completely wipe out autonomous vehicles and ones that are heavily integrated with with technology. And I see that there's this huge push, and with an article that you shared with me, to, I guess, automatize the logistical chain, which is to say, back in the day, for those of you who don't know, it was dudes in trucks that would drive all the
Hmm.
way from, the supply base in a kind of courier setting, UPS, all the way to the front line. They would resupply at a supply dump, and so on and so forth. But now the Army is trying to transition to free up manpower from the logistical chain and repurpose that manpower away from motor to towards frontline combat units. And I guess,
Hmm.
what I wanted to say, isn't that a huge mistake in the sense that we're going to go into a war where the enemy is able to spoof or, completely subvert our technology?
So, in my opinion, so this is just Peter Wrangel's opinion. Yeah, it's a mistake for two reasons. One, yes, you have that electronic side where you're going to be able to jam, you're going to be able to interdict, you're going to be able to hijack, you're able to hack, and so the more you try to harden that piece of that autonomous vehicle, the more bulky, the harder it is to interface for maintenance, and so forth. It comes with a litany of issues,
Mm-hmm.
and so in a in an effort to free up all this manpower, it's going to cause more. There's a potential to cause more headache than anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the second part of that is a mistake is uh, I came across some information where it has been discussed that some of the selling points on the whole push for autonomous vehicles, especially in the transportation sector, and now in the transportation field, and then in the say um, threat platforms, the autonomous Bradleys, autonomous type of platforms that would have weapons attached,
Mm-hmm.
is the savings in either money and for maintenance, upkeep, and personnel isn't quite true, or at least it is underestimated to where it's at null. There's no real change. So if this autonomous piece of equipment that is meant to be with the squad to move equipment and so forth, well, the savings in personnel probably isn't going to be there because you're going to need a maintainer, you're going to need a driver,
Right.
then you're going to need people back at home stations for level 2, level 3 maintenance,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. So a deeper analysis into some of these savings, whether in personnel or finance or financials, isn't quite there. And so when that becomes evident in the next several years, I'm very interested to see what the Pentagon does with a lot of these programs.
And so it's interesting because I think this is a response. It's a multifaceted response, which I think we should. It's not monistic, right? It's not like they're trying to solve for one problem. And I think when we're outsiders, yes, of course, a lot of the general staff officers are in the Pentagon are definitely bought by Raytheon, all that kind of stuff, and they make. Well, you don't have to agree with that, but that's my perception here. And
Yeah,
but also they're not stupid, and also they're not just
yeah,
blatantly, I guess misappropriating funds. At least I would hope not.
I,
But I guess my larger point that I'm trying to make is, and you brought up this article, which I'll share with you, Legionaries. It's two-part article, which is the U.S. Army Big Six requirements and programs, and this program deals with the, I guess, new emphases which the Army wants to, I guess, emphasize, right? So, for instance,
mm-hmm,
long-range precision fires, long-range hypersonic weapon batteries, mid-range missiles, uh, next-generation combat vehicles. So, think of innovations on the Stryker, the Bradley, all these old Cold War base platforms they want to kind of revamp. And then, of course, unmanned robotic systems. And in the context here, which is very interesting, they show this picture of a land-based UAS, almost light tank situation called the M5 Ripsaw. Um,
mm-hmm,
and of course, and then it says unmanned aerial systems, as we already know, and it's likely that the all the way down to the squad level. I know the Marine Corps is already doing this, but the squad level is going to be utilizing small drones, just like they do in Ukraine, and of course AA battery systems that are new and more integrated than previously. And of course they're talking about next generation squad weapons and new kits and stuff like that. I'm trepidatious about because if you're thinking about it in a large scale warfare, right? Like, of course, this is probably what the future, maybe 2 or 3 wars down the line elements would all have uniformly. However, you don't go to war with the army that you want. You go to war with the army that you got. And I guess that's the question I wanted to ask you. 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, experiences exclusively of coin operations, with the exception, of course, of our experience in the Ukraine, which, make no mistake, a lot of our advisors are there gleaning from that. But large army has no experience with outside of coin or basically police actions writ large. And so I wanted to ask you, how ready is the big army right now? If today China invaded Taiwan, how prepared or capable would we be? And obviously, you don't have to reveal too much that would, impinge on stuff. But, what can you say?
Well, what I would like to say, or I guess, what my opinion is good leadership is good leadership, no matter the operational environment, whether it be coin, whether it be large-scale combat operations. If you're a good leader, right, then you'll be a good leader in either one. And that's just how I see it. Because you're going to understand the basics. You're going to understand what it means to take care of those below you, right? Those who really do the work. A good platoon leader in coin will probably be a good platoon leader in large-scale combat operations. I only say this because, going into World War II, the U.S. military and the Army really didn't have much experience in large-scale combat operations since the Civil War. I mean, you can't really. If you really think about it, and that's why it got its ass handed to itself during operations in North Africa. It just did Kasserine Pass. It was a draw, and it killed a lot of Americans for no reason. A lot of generals got reassigned, and because of that, people like Patton and others were able to rise to the top. But again, where did Patton learn how to be a tank commander of large maneuver warfare? Just that didn't exist, right? But he was a good leader. The wars that the officers that did the best during, who rose to the top in World War II were, they had the experience of World War I, but they had experience from the Banana Wars in Nicaragua, from the invasion of Cuba, the occupation of Cuba. Those are all coin operations, right, or occupation duties. Hell, some of them even went back to maybe even the Boxer Rebellion. I don't know, but
just before you continue, absolutely. There's always a way to win. I mean, think for instance, Korea and the Red Army. I mean, those guys were severely under munitioned. They were underprepared. They just, obviously we're not going to wage war that way, but where there's a will, there's a way, and so there's no excuse. But go ahead.
and I think that's where we're leaning into in the future, right? So the problem that you're having now is no one wants to join the military. No one wants to join the Army. Why? Well, because they saw what happened in the last 20 years. They saw soldiers just kind of being left behind and being ignored and fading into the background, and they don't want to be a part of that. That's part and parcel with the issue of having a large standing army, right? Because they're just always there in the background of people's minds, but no one really pays attention to them. And so when that happens, no one really is invested in it. When you kind of disassociate the populace from the military, you get this kind of, it doesn't ever really going to affect me. And so no one really joins, no one thinks about it. And because there isn't this national will, this national unity, this national will to fight or win that was there. The 9/11 happened, 9/12, patriotism, the amount of patriotism everywhere in the United States was, I could only imagine, was applicable. I could only assume it would be right after Pearl Harbor, right? And
Yes.
it was squandered. It was absolutely squandered, right? For 20 years of almost nothing, right? And people know that. People realize that. People who were in the military for that long, and that's why they don't. That's why they are telling others not to join, and that's really hampering recruitment and retention. And
Mhm.
that is the problem going into the future.
You know, I think about this too, and because here's the thing that people don't understand, right? Is that they're like, well, World War II, we had this massive, how do you say, this massive resurgence of war support and solidarity. And of course, the context of America is very different back then than it
Yeah.
is today. I mean, today we're far more divided. I mean, fuck, if I go over the hill, I feel like I'm in a different country. And so that
Well,
wasn't the
I
case.
mean, the Army. I mean, so the U.S. of December 7th, 1941 is different than the America that on VE Day and VJ Day, right?
Hmm.
The America that is different than the America that existed on 9/11,
Hmm.
and is different than the America that exists right now today. Those are almost four totally different like societies almost, and so you cannot replicate them again ever again, right? The America that existed on 9/11 does not exist today, right? So
Exactly.
what does that mean going? What does that mean going into the future?
Right, and the
And I
trajectory
think that,
is
and I think
downward, right?
I think that's kind of, I wouldn't say overlooked or neglected. That's just kind of assumed, like that it's just a situation that will continue in perpetual situation.
Hmm.
Like that, America will always be like that. If something were to happen, there will be a resurgence of a patriotism post 9/11.
Hmm.
Like,
Well,
and Russia invaded Ukraine, and like people were like, okay.
so that's the interesting thing is that, so as I was saying before, the reason why we had this solidarity is because of the fact that we were directly attacked, right? Obviously, you can make the, I mean, the United States was basically provoking the Japanese to attack, and the Japanese did so, and they, I guess they threw the dice on that thing, and they obviously lost. However, I think the Russians and the Chinese are far smarter political maneuverists than we are, especially because they don't lack any strategic resources necessary from abroad. That is to say, the Japanese attacked the United States because of the oil embargo, right? And so they
Mm-hmm.
felt that it was, incumbent on themselves to preempt any strike that the U.S. Navy was about to inflict on the Japanese. And they felt that the United States was going to enter the war at some point. However, the Chinese and the Russians and that bloc, Iran and so on, they have everything they need. They have everything from microchip processing plants to oil, strategic oil reserves, gas. They have all the energy requirements that are necessary. They have the hard industry. They have X, Y, and Z. So they're able to make the how do you say, the invasions of their choice. They can choose the wars that
Mm-hmm.
they want without making the massive mistake of having to do a first strike against the United States, which of course would circumvent the war support. So if I feel like if we were attacked, we would feel like, I guess there would be some kind of
Mm-hmm.
unity, but I think that the Russians and the Chinese are very like smart on that aspect, is they never attack us outright, and that's why it's really hard to, even right now, to gather war support for Ukraine. I mean, nobody. I mean, why are we even there? Why does it matter? In the Cold War, like it was part of the same country. I mean, like there's nothing really to gain, and it seems like there's everything to lose from a continued association. And of course, these are not my opinions, but the wider opinion of the American public.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to. I mean, propaganda can only go so far, right? Until it's your ass
Mm-hmm.
on the line that has to fight over a stupid war on some distant battlefield, right? So I guess
I would
go ahead.
the only I guess the only no you ask your question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I guess my larger question that I wanted to ask, and you shared a couple articles, especially with the officer
Mm-hmm.
corps on average having a
Yeah.
lower IQ and
Yeah.
fewer credentials than they did in their
Mm-hmm.
I guess not their ancestors, but their forebears, right? Their forebears had
Yeah.
definitely a higher standard of education and a higher standard of just human material. And I guess furthermore, there's a lack of will, which is probably the prime thing in war. I mean, you can talk about
Yeah.
armament, you can talk about intellect, you can talk about plans and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's who wants it more. How much are you willing to bleed for a certain thing? And we're seeing that with, how the Taliban was able to overcome an enemy which ostensibly was superior in every level, but at the end of the day, they had the will to stay, right? So they won.
Yeah.
Um,
Strategic patience.
there you go, exactly. And I feel like we don't have that. Why would I fight a tyrant 3,000 miles away when I got 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? So, I mean, I wanted your perspective as far as how is it that you think the Army can get around low will, the low human capital that is left? How do we reapproach the American public?
So I guess kind of the best way to frame it is, within you're talking a lot about a lot of issues, right? But I think at the core of this is demographics, right? Demographic decline, birth rate decline, TRF rates, and so forth, the fertility rates around the world. And those issues are not just in the West, right? They affect Russia, right? The population of Russia is declining. Ukrainian population is declining. And the one-child policy in China is having a huge impact on strategic decision-making in China by the CCP. They have hundreds of millions of single men who have no marriage prospects and no financial future in China. So what do you do with them? So I don't think the timeline that a lot of people in the West see as that they have for the strategic patience for, say, China, right? That we're used for them to thinking in like decades and centuries, and their civilizations thousands of years, right? I think it's a lot shorter than people may want to give credit to or really want to accept. So, Russia and China, I don't believe they have the comfort of time on their side as we once believed, and that is why that's part of the reason why I think that Russia went into Ukraine. They saw calculus within Putin's mind and so forth, demographic decline, resurgent West maybe, and so forth. But when it comes to China, and if China is really this near peer threat, I don't think they have time just to sit by and wait for Taiwan to do certain things on their own. That's why they're being a little bit more belligerent, being a little bit more forceful, using certain words. Hell, they went out and glad-handed the future president of the United States, Gavin Newsom, out there in San Francisco, right? That's why they have to be a little bit more proactive, because time isn't really on their side. And so how does the U.S. Army or the U.S. military kind of fix this problem? Boy, man, if you could answer that, you'd have a $1 billion check waiting for you.
No, yeah,
I kid you not.
100%. 100%.
Because I don't think they have. I think that the push to make the military smaller, the U.S. Army smaller, is a design to get ahead of a problem, because they saw that there is a decline in retention and recruitment, and so instead of reacting to that, they're trying to be proactive. That's why they're pushing autonomous vehicles, autonomy in other types of systems, because they know no one wants to join. And I think that's their answer, to be completely honest, is machines, autonomous machines, AI. They're really heavily leaning into AI. But again, does that really solve the problem? Does that really solve the problem of will, right? It's all about will, what a military is willing to fight for.
So it's interesting that you say that, because the interesting thought that I've had recurring, and especially if you look at Ukraine war videos of both sides, how old the average infantryman or frontline combat soldier is. I mean, really old. Like, he's like in his 40s or 50s. Like, there are dudes from the Chechen wars who are veterans who are fighting every day.
Well,
and
they also don't forget, like, they lived, so there's a reason why they're alive. There's a reason why that 40-year-old infantryman is alive, because they know how to survive. That's all I can say.
Well, you know why the sky is blue, right?
Because it's not green. I don't know.
No, because God loves the infantry. No, but anyway, no, but as I was saying, like the interesting thing about technology is that the scope of a military age male's utility has increased as well. And if you're seeing
Mm,
with the design of war, I mean, really, aside from some crack, divisions or penetrating units, like the airborne or whoever is doing the stormtrooper stuff, you just need a dude
yeah.
with a rifle who has discipline, and will advance when he's told to advance, and who will stay in a hole for months on end and defend a position, and that's all you need. And so, I think going into the future, the Army, and I've read a lot of articles about compelling conscript service during peacetime to fill out the
Hmm.
requirements of the U.S. military. And obviously, this is something extremely unpopular, especially because many Americans, both left and right and center, feel that the government or the state doesn't represent the interests of the American people. And so it's very difficult to feel as though that's even worth it on one's part. And I guess just to address, maybe say things that you're not allowed to say. I think
Hmm.
that the way to overcome our issues are, of course, I guess, reacquainting the interests of the American people with the system of government that we have. There's this weird dichotomy or culture in the United States, where we kind of like always feel like the government is the big bad guy. Well,
Hmm.
I think the reality is it's only the big bad guy because we've relegated it to subversive enemies or people from within who use it for bad, under bad pretenses. And it's basically good men who refuse to rule, as Plato said. And so,
Hmm.
part of my, I guess, project here at Lance's Legion is to, I guess, encourage a citizen body who engages with the U.S. government, your government, our government, to be more responsible citizens in governance, right? So why is it that we're doing things such as overextending ourselves in the Ukraine, completely emptying out our stores of Cold War hardware that's hard to replace? Obviously we don't have the same industrial base. Why are we doing this misstep? Well, people say it's incentive structures, but at the end of the day, remember that structures are made up of human beings, and human beings have agency. There's never an excuse, and therefore the reason why these quote-unquote incentive structures exist is precisely because men have decided that they should stay. There's always a solution, and I want people to start being part of the solution as opposed to simply critiquing the thing writ large. Now, there's a lot of studies that talk about, whether it's pro-natal, and I don't know if you're aware, like how big
Hmm.
Elon Musk is in about having kids and stuff like that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 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 Wherever company he goes to, he gets some woman pregnant.
Based. No, but you know what I'm saying, though. And
Yeah.
apparently,
Yeah. Yeah.
Hungary is giving incentives. If you have like 4 kids,
Hmm.
you never have to pay income taxes in your
Hmm.
life,
Yep.
or
Yep.
whatever.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The demographic decline demographic decline that Musk talks about, and the human population on Earth is decline, is an existential issue and problem that more people on this planet need to be aware of. Yes, I agree. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, exactly. But here's my critique: is that apparently, trying to bribe people to have kids or using a very bourgeois merchant mindset to try and induce people to procreate will never A, actually happen, and B, the progeny or the product of that union will always be inferior. I think what the problem of our time, especially the modern zeitgeist, is this greater sense in the West of a lack of purpose, a lack of self
Yes.
confidence, and a lack of will. And that's brought on by, of course, like I said, the lack of a grand purpose. So, for instance,
Hmm.
back in the olden days, the United States was established by a bunch of Masons and liberals with the view of turning a country, a new world, into something new. It was like this vision, a crusading mission of changing man into a higher self where he could be, it was a meritocracy where man could win and lose on his own merits as opposed to being, enslaved by, whatever structures the Europeans had at that time. Now, I think that's died off. I think it doesn't resonate with people because we've seen the cumulus of that project, and we are kind of shrinking back in horror as far as what it implies or implicates, and then second of all, people are hungry for some greater vision, and I think you see emulations or glitterings of that in, for instance, Elon Musk's like project to go to
Hmm.
Mars or whatever. But without a nation gathered together by a grand mission that people really truly love, I don't think that we'll be able to solve the population issue, because remember, humans are capable of enduring immense hardship. Hell, you and I were descended from Neolithic ancestors who used to
Hmm.
fucking have kids when they were starving, and there's saber tooth. Like the future was bleak always until
Yeah.
very recently. And so, what's the difference? It has nothing to do with prospects. Yes, I do believe the next 50 years will not be great for the United States. Maybe. That is, of course, if we do something about it. But if we don't do anything about it, it'd be bleak. However, the reason why people don't want to face that selfless pain is because we don't have a why, and so therefore all the pain that we feel is almost 10x because of the fact that we
Yeah.
don't have a context to feed it in. And so I think this is why the coming centuries will be a century of like fervent religion and reacquaintance with grand spiritual missions which extend beyond simply petty self-interest. So in the United States, the Gordon Gekko idea of basically, oh, I want to live my life so I can become a interior home decorator, and that's what America's about, or making big money. And people realize that's like turning like ash in their mouths because it doesn't fulfill anyone, and that basically
Hmm.
we're kind of tired of that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this: is that America will fix its problems when it starts asserting itself of what it truly is, and maybe that is a kind of renaissance or something like that, culturally speaking, or a new tack that we take in the history of our nation. But I wanted your take. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think there's a possibility of that?
I think that I think America and the West in general are going to come face to face with the realization and understanding of why strong men of history were had an appeal to them, right?
Hmm.
You can your listeners can take that one way or the other. You can take it however you want, but I think a lot of people are going to are going to come to terms with why people turn to strong men, leaders, in times of crisis, in times of existential crisis. And that's all I can say about that. That's all I want to say about that is that that's what I think that's going to happen.
I think so too. And here's the thing that I think a lot of people, their perception of reality is very passive. And what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by that is like basically, oh, demographic change is inevitable. Things are going to go to shit. It's inevitable. My life is shit. It's inevitable. And that is not reality. That's the projection of what that person is on the inside, which is to say somebody fundamentally weak and willing to,
Mm-hmm.
unwilling to face or change the odds. History is replete with not just the military history, but history in general, civil history, of men and women who were able to say, no, this shit sucks. We're gonna fix this shit, and we're gonna make it
Mm-hmm.
better. And we did. And so I guess that's the thing that I think many of you listeners should really take home, is this concept that whether we win or lose, whether times are good or bad, is entirely up to us. It's entirely within our agency and our ability to affect and change. And so I want you to never ever delegate the importance of the time and use that as a reason to be a defeatist. Always seek the path to victory. Always find a way to win. And so long as you can, you will always find it at the end of that road. And so I think that's really the most important part of the military ethos, which is why I believe that the future leader of our time will be fundamentally a military man. I mean, he doesn't have to be active or anything. I'm just saying that like he'll be descended from that aspect, because I'm sure you feel this way, but like in the army or the military in general, it teaches you to overcome adversity and find a way to, improvise, adapt, overcome, all those kind of cliches.
Mm-hmm.
And it's precisely that kind of aspect that we need to reanimate the greater body politic of the United States. I mean, what do you think?
Um, I agree that the individual that would be turned to would have a military mindset, but I wouldn't lean too heavily into them being like a senior leader
Mm-hmm.
per se.
Mm-hmm.
Because with that comes a bunch of baggage and mind and certain types of
Yes, I
dogma
understand.
and everything.
Yeah, I understand.
But yeah, I do see someone with that mindset of being almost like a I hate being cliche, but almost like a civilian military combination, like someone from I know I'm in the National Guard, but someone from the Guard perspective, who sees it both ways, right? Because a full-time member of the active military, active duty, is kind of inoculated from a lot of the, you can say, ups and downs of society, versus someone in the National Guard who's in society but also in the military as well, if that makes sense.
So you think that the citizen soldier is the archetype that will come in the future?
Yes, yeah, it's the archetype that typically came up from in the history, and for certain reasons, right? And I don't see it changing in the future. Because they're going to be able to. They're going to have to be able to relate to the common man, common woman, common person, common man, but also understand the bigger picture of what the military or the government does. And to me, is that citizen soldier, that person who straddles that line.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that, in my opinion, is with the National Guard has been turned into this operational reserve, and so the linkage between the community and say a National Guard unit or community is degrading, right? And that's having ramifications and future ramifications that are going to have some lasting damage, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And this is part of my project, is basically on the social strata re-glorifying the warrior, because I mean, even Thomas Jefferson said that every great republic was made of men and women who were fundamentally warriors as well as civilians. And if you look at Rome, the reason for their success is a lot of the reason why is because they both came from their leaders were expected to execute on both political matters, leadership of the civil location as well as the military one.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this good blend between, the virtues of civil service and those of military discipline. One corrects the other, and one, kind of negates the other's negative aspects. And so I think that's a good place to leave it there as far as that conversation's concerned.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to ask you this. So we're talking about a transition, right, of the Army to 2040, and the scaling up of both manpower, the changes in platform. However, I think we're finding that the military is in a situation it found itself after Vietnam. Vietnam being, of course, for those of you who don't know, was a time, especially for the Army and the Marine Corps, where basically everyone and anyone could get in, and there was a lapse in discipline. There was a stagnation, rather, in doctrine and inability to kind of, meet the challenge which the Vietnamese posed to the American soldiers in Vietnam. And after the war, what happened was that we were stuck with this mass conscript force that was very similar to the one that we went to war with in Korea and earlier on in Europe during World War II, and I guess the Pacific as well. But it wasn't meeting the challenges of today. I think what's happening today is that basically we have a military force that is specifically geared towards, obviously, coin operations and small unit engagements, which place a premium on maneuver and dispersal, without actually having the weight and cohesion of a larger force to defeat other near-peer larger forces. And so I guess I wanted to pick your brain. What are the major challenges for the Army of 2040 in the actual transition?
Who's going to staff it? I mean, that seems kind of, it seems kind of obvious. I mean, an obvious question, but if they're having trouble filling the ranks now, post GWOT, and this supposedly not combat, but we're still have troops being fired at, and we're firing each other in Iraq and Syria, and troops in contact and everything. Who's going to fill the ranks of the Army of 2030 and Army 2040?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the biggest issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why do we? I mean, again, why do we still have an airborne division? Who's going to do airborne? Like, are we ever going to do airborne ops at division level? Like, again, it's just again, who is going to fill the ranks? And I think the answer to that is going to surprise a lot of people, and it's going to be very concerning.
Do you mind expanding on that a little bit?
So, well, I mean, it's public record. I mean, Dick Durbin's already called for illegal immigrants being able to serve immediately upon their stepping foot into the United States in the U.S. military. Currently, we do have a program where if you are a green card holder, not a citizen yet, you can serve in the military. You know, a lot of people were sworn in as U.S. citizens in Baghdad, the Green Zone during the Iraq War, OIF, which is kind of strange anyway. But they still were somewhere in the process already of having a green card. Mm-hmm. What is being proposed is essentially you almost like that scene in was it Gangs in New York? The Irish are getting off the boat. They sign some data. They sign a piece of paper saying they're a citizen. Then they sign the next document where they enlist in the Union Army. They get on another boat and then they go off to fight in the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. Could it be that dramatic? Probably not. But it's the proposal's already out there. So
you know, the interesting thing though is that like I don't think that the illegals that would actually be willing to serve. I mean, by and large, because I mean, usually they're coming here because they think America's Las Vegas and that they had a hard time in their home country, and so they're coming here for money. They're not really coming here to go and fight. Whereas if you juxtapose, for instance, the Union during the Civil War, the people that were coming here and serving in the Union Army came here because they were escaping like starvation. So it's like stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, the dynamic here is different, where the immigrant is coming here for a good time as opposed to a hard time, which is like, well, if you're going to come here for war, I feel like people would just end up, dipping. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I agree with you on that sense, but that's May 11th of 2024. I don't know what it'd be in 5 to 10 years. That's the issue. That's 20. So 2024 is what, 16 years away?
Yes.
A lot can change between now and then. And that's all. And I'm not trying to be mysterious or anything like that. but the motivations and what drives people to immigrate could change. And the incentive packages could be modified. Mm-hmm. We don't know.
No, you're right. And I think that obviously things can change in a year, let alone a decade, or a couple.
If in 2024, a U.S. senator can make this proposal, what will a U.S. senator propose in, say, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? What would be acceptable? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the biggest challenge, of course, is overcoming something that will probably maintained, for 2 decades down the line. It won't really change fundamentally, which is the poor human capital we have to work with. Yes. Not just physical fitness and lifetime lack of exposure to physical fitness and rigor, but also mental fitness. The higher levels of people who have never faced any challenges in their life and they're already mentally compromised by the age of 10 or something. And then, of course, worse still is the declining IQ rates, which people think is not a big deal, but it is a massive deal, especially on the battlefield. There's a reason why you want your smartest guys, making plans and in leadership positions, precisely because those are the guys that are making the right calls at a faster pace. They're running through the OODA loop faster. And if you're able to do that, you're able to crush the enemy. And so, I mean, what do you think is the solution to that, or is that just simply ambiguous now?
I mean, that's you're talking about how to solve demographic change in the United States, right there, and also how do you change the dropping IQ rate of the world? And maybe it's because my IQ is smaller than my grandfather's or lower than my grandfather's, but I don't have an answer. I do, but it'd be it's draconian. It would be, how would you? It would be.
I understand. Yeah, I understand.
It's the medicine or cure to the ills of America in 2024 could be so shocking and so jarring to the system, to the ecosystem of society, government, and economy, that it could be just as bad as if we continue on the path that we're on now. That's the problem. That is fundamentally the problem. Mm-hmm. The solution could be just as bad as the problem.
I see what you're saying. So we're coming up here on the last 10 minutes, and I guess I wanted to transition to any things that you wanted to actually talk about specifically that you've been holding under your wing.
No, I mean, I'm a predictor. I like looking into, putting dots together, trying to paint a picture. And I've been trying to deep dive into the Army 2030 and Army 2040, not as much for multiple reasons. One is how we see the threat of the future, but also what does the Army of 2040, the military is always a reflection of the society that it pulls from. So if the U.S. Army government, the Pentagon, is saying the Army of 2040 is going to look like this, well, what does that mean? How do they perceive the U.S. society being in 2040? Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And so if you kind of backward engineer that, if they're saying this is going to be the force structure, these are going to be the weapon systems, these are going to be the threats, well, what does that mean as a reflection to America in 2040? And I think that a lot of people kind of need to start asking themselves that. What is the America 2040 going to be? And is it going to be full of people who are willing to fight for that nation of 2040? I don't know. 16 years from now, I'll be well out of the Army. My children will be, the oldest she'd be 18, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And so what does that mean for her? Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a good point. Women still aren't, they don't still have to sign up for the selective service. And so that's just a reflection of the society that we're in, the Army of the America of 2024. And so, when looking at these future type of conflicts or these future types of situations, what does that mean as a reflection of America and at that time period, if that makes sense? And so that's something I've just kind of been tossing around my head every so often.
That's the interesting part, and the challenge that we face as Americans is that we don't have very much positive control as far as how the United States is expressed. Maybe obviously there's this theory that it's like the elites, right? The elites are the ones who ultimately make the decisions, and the lack of cohesion between what the people want and what the elites are choosing is just the effect that we don't have power and they do. So, the interesting thing about China, which is a great example about what you're talking about, is that they can plan out into the future 100 years. They can say, okay, like we need to stop, having so many children, for instance, with the one-child policy, right? And obviously that had massive externalities, but at the end of the day, they could predict and they could change things, right? But for us, we don't have that power. We don't even have the will to enforce borders, let alone, of course, say, for instance, we can't even say, oh, we'll offer you, incentives to have kids or something like that because, there's all this, like, fighting over biological realities or something. And it's just so crazy that it's like, I don't even know, like, how we would even get ourselves out of shit. And so, no, I completely agree with you, and it's definitely something that really is up to the gods in a way, right? It'll come down to a throw of the dice and how things land. But
I think one last thing is